Shalom. I'm Eddie Chumney of Hebraic Heritage Ministries, and we welcome you to this week's Focus Israel Report. In this week's report, we're going to be sharing with you part 2 of our research and analysis of why Russia aggressively went into Syria the first week of October in support of Syrian President Bashar Assad. We're going to see how the war in Syria is connected with who has the power and control over natural gas and its pipelines in the Middle East. And it is as follows. The roots of the war in Syria is centered in the development, supply, and control of oil and natural gas reserves in Middle Eastern countries and the pipelines needed to send them primarily to Europe. Syria is not a major oil producer. Until the start of the Syrian civil war in March of 2011, Syria was making a hardly negligible $4 billion a year in oil sales, which is 1/3 of the Syrian government's budget for the year. Nevertheless, Syria is a strategic country to transport natural gas from various Middle Eastern countries to Europe. Syria is already part of a Western ordained gas pipeline that spans from Egypt to Syria. This pipeline, known as the Arab Gas Pipeline, was originally planned to continue traveling from Syria into Turkey. From there, it can be piped into various regions in Europe. The major players of this Western-approved pipeline include Saudi Arabia and Qatar, among other Gulf nations. In 1989, Qatar and Iran began to develop the South Pars North Dome natural gas field, which is buried 3,000 meters below the floor of the Persian Gulf. With 51 trillion cubic meters of gas and 50 billion cubic meters of liquid condensates, it is the largest natural gas field in the world. Approximately 1/3 of this gas field belongs to Iran, and the other 2/3 belongs to Qatar. The major market for this gas is Europe. Iran has strategic ties with Syria, and Syria is backed by Russia. Qatar is aligned with the United States and Europe. Since this discovery, Qatar has invested heavily in liquefied natural gas plants and terminals that enable it to ship its gas around the world in tankers. Qatar is the world's leading exporter of liquefied natural gas. Yet liquefaction and shipping increases total costs, and particularly as gas prices have slipped, Qatari gas has remained easily undercut in European markets by cheaper pipeline gas from Russia and elsewhere. As a result, it would be highly beneficial to Qatar to be able to send their natural gas to Europe by a pipeline. As a result, in 2009, Qatar proposed to President Bashar Assad of Syria to build a pipeline to send its gas northwest via Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Syria, which would eventually reach Europe. 2 different routes for such a pipeline were possible. One would lead from Qatar through Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq to Turkey. The other would go through Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Syria, and then on to Turkey. Assad refused to agree to the proposal by Qatar to build a pipeline through Syria. A French newspaper report claimed that Assad's rationale was to protect the interests of his Russian ally, which is Europe's top supplier of natural gas. For Qatar, the investment to build the pipeline would be billions of dollars up front, but it would reduce its existing high transportation costs over the long term. To complicate matters, Saudi Arabia was not interested in a gas pipeline from Qatar to go through its country. Saudi Arabia has a track record of obstructing regional pipeline projects and for decades has had a tense political relationship with Qatar. In 2010, Assad pursued negotiations for an alternative $10 billion pipeline plan with Iran across Iraq to Syria that would also potentially allow Iran to supply gas to Europe from its shared gas field with Qatar. It would be completed by 2016. Russia blessed this project, possibly believing that it would have an easier time dealing with Iran than Qatar to control gas imports to Europe from Iran, the Caspian Sea region, and Central Asia. This alternative pipeline plan would carry Iran and Iraq's gas to Europe instead of gas from Qatar, and this option further pleased Russia's Putin because he already had a long-standing energy agreement in place with Iran. Next, Syria signed a memorandum of understanding with Iraq to build 1 gas and 2 oil pipelines with its target destination being Europe. In July 2011, just weeks after the Syrian civil war broke out, the Tehran Times released a report entitled, "Iran, Iraq, Syria Sign a Major Gas Pipeline Deal." The report provided details on Iranian plans to export its vast natural gas reserves to Europe through a pipeline that would travel through both Iraq and Syria. This new Iran-Iraq-Syria pipeline would reportedly be the largest gas pipeline in the Middle East and would span from Iran's gas-rich South Pars field to the Mediterranean coastline in Lebanon through Iraq and Syria. The Iran-Iraq-Syria pipeline is sometimes called the Islamic gas pipeline. However, the proposed pipeline wouldn't stop in Syria. The agreement calls for the construction of an underwater pipeline under the Mediterranean Sea stretching from Lebanon to Greece to deliver Iranian gas to energy-hungry European nations. The Iran-Iraq-Syria gas pipeline became a threat to the Arab gas pipeline as it would compete directly with the Arab gas pipeline's goal of delivering Middle East natural gas to Europe as well. As a long-term supporter of Syria, Russia had built up influence within the administration and the armed services. Also, Russia's only military base in the Mediterranean is located on the coast of Syria, which would strategically allow Putin to control a second gas pipeline to Europe. Naturally, this Iranian pipeline to Syria quickly became a top priority for Russia. Therefore, Assad and the Russians worked their contacts within Syria to dissuade the Qatar pipeline and to promote instead the Iranian pipeline. The Memorandum of Understanding for the Iran-Iraq-Syria gas pipeline was signed in July 2012. In July 2013, leaders from Syria, Iran, and Iraq met to sign a preliminary agreement on the pipeline with the hopes of finalizing the deal by the end of the year. This pipeline would bypass Turkey. The plan by Assad to support the Iran-Iraq-Syria pipeline plan was a direct slap in the face to Qatar's plans to build a pipeline through Syria. In July 2013, Russia rejected a Saudi proposal to abandon Syrian President Bashar Assad in return for a huge arms deal and a pledge to boost Russian influence in the Arab world. On July 31, 2013, Russian President Vladimir Putin, a strong backer of Syrian leader Bashar Assad, met Saudi Arabia's intelligence chief Prince Bandar bin Sultan. During the meeting in Russia, the Saudi official explained that Saudi Arabia is ready to help Russia play a bigger role in the Middle East at a time when the United States is disengaging from the region. As a result of Syrian President Bashar Assad's decision to reject the Qatar pipeline going through Syria to Europe and instead embracing the Iran-Iraq-Syria pipeline, the decision was made to start an uprising backed by the United States and Europe to remove Assad from power. This uprising started in March 2011 as armed protesters opposed the Assad government. As a result, the United States, France, Britain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, who regard themselves as the Friends of Syria coalition, began to publicly call for the overthrow of Syrian President Bashar Assad between 2011 and 2012, after Assad's refusal to sign onto the Qatar gas pipeline through Syria to Europe. Qatar began working to oust the Assad regime by funding rebel groups to the tune of an estimated $3 billion between 2011 and 2013. For nearly 15 years, Gulf nations and their Western-based militaries have been plotting an overthrow of the Syrian government. In 2001, former U.S. General Wesley Clark admitted that the United States made a decision to topple the Syrian government. In May of 2007, a presidential finding revealed that the Saudi government, with the United States' approval, would provide funds and logistical aid to weaken the government of President Bashar Assad of Syria. One faction chosen to receive covert U.S. political and financial support through the Saudis was the exiled Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. According to former French Foreign Minister Roland Dumas, Britain had planned covert action in Syria as early as 2009. Speaking with French television, Dumas said, "I met with top British officials who confessed to me that they were preparing something in Syria. Britain was preparing gunmen to invade Syria." According to retired NATO Secretary General Wesley Clark, the U.S. strategy in the region is fundamentally about control of the region's vast oil and gas reserves. So, how do we understand the dynamics of the disagreement between Russia and the West over the support of Syrian President Bashar Assad? In October 2015, the Russian military went into Syria. So why is Russia backing Assad? Russia supports the Iran-Iraq-Syrian pipeline. Why are they choosing to side with Syria despite the massive propaganda push by the West against the Assad government? It is because Russia's economy is predominantly based upon its enormous energy exports. Much of Europe is dependent upon Russian oil and gas, and this dependency is growing. Russia boasts the largest natural gas reserves in the world. The Russian energy company Gazprom is the world's largest extractor of natural gas. It currently delivers gas to over 25 European countries. Europe is the source of 40% of Gazprom's yearly revenue. Which country has the second largest natural gas reserves in the world? It is Iran. In addition to Russia, Iran has also firmly opposed the removal of Assad from power. In fact, since the start of the fighting, Iran has provided the most extensive support to the Assad government. By some accounts, it is more or less running the Syrian army, as well as supplying it with weapons and now even troops from its Revolutionary Guard. Russia has its eye on the potential profits of bringing Iranian oil and gas online for Europe. For this reason, and among a myriad of others, Russia has sought to solidify its relations with Iran. The most direct route for moving Iran's energy supplies to Europe is right through the heart of Iraq and into Syria. As the Iranian nuclear deal has lifted sanctions from Iran, two power blocs have emerged in the Middle East. One is Iran, Iraq, and Syria, which are all Shiite-led, and the rest of the Arab world, which is Sunni and stands against the Shiites. While America holds the alliance of the Sunni world, Russia is siding with the Shiite-controlled nations. Most Arabs view the Iran-Iraq-Syria pipeline as a Shiite pipeline serving Shiite interests. After all, it originates in Shiite Iran, passes through Shiite Iraq, and flows into Shiite-controlled Syria. Therefore, the Sunni-dominated Gulf nations have both an economic and religious reason for preventing the Iran-Iraq-Syria pipeline from becoming a reality. So far, the Gulf nations have violently opposed Syria's adoption of the Iran-Iraq-Syria pipeline by arming opposition fighters within Syria in order to destabilize the nation. This also explains why Russia has chosen to target Qatari and Saudi-funded rebel groups in Syria in its bombing campaigns in addition to bombing ISIS. If Syria, Iran, Iraq gas pipelines come into existence, Russia and its energy company Gazprom would economically benefit. Therefore, Russia is backing Syria and consequently Iran and Iraq. Because the West is eager to lessen the dependence of Russian natural gas to Europe and replace it with supplies from the Persian Gulf area, the West wants to remove Assad from power in Syria. Because having a pipeline from the Persian Gulf that runs through Syria to Europe is a major key to achieving energy independence from Russia, and because Syria politically leans in favor of Russia and Iran, it was decided in Western capitals that Assad needed to be removed from power. Well, that's going to conclude this week's report, where we shared with you an analysis and insight regarding why Russia aggressively went into Syria the first week of October to support Syrian President Bashar Assad. Ultimately, the true reason is a fight between the West and Russia over the control and power of natural gas and its pipelines in the Middle East. Until we do it again, Shalom in Yeshua the Messiah. Amen.